Good morning, everyone. Welcome in to the Intrigue Media session with the legendary Anne Applebaum. We'll just wait for a few more folks to trickle in and then I can start formal introductions. Very, very happy to have Anne join us. I think she's on European time today, so we'll just have her for 30 minutes, but we'll make this very tight and get through a lot of interesting questions to throw her way. For those of you who are coming in and not familiar with Intrigue Media, we are a geopolitical media company based in the US, focused on connecting the issues between geopolitics, tech, and business, and written by former diplomats. If you'd like to subscribe, please tune into www.internationalintrigue.io, and it's free to subscribe for your daily intrigue briefing. Well, with that, I would love to introduce Anne formally. I had the pleasure of meeting Anne recently after following her work for many years and was absolutely blown away by her. Anne is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, historian, journalist who's renowned for her work on authoritarianism, disinformation, and Eastern European history. Anne studied at Yale, the law school, the London School of Economics, and Oxford before reporting on the fall of communism in Warsaw for The Economist. Her books, including Gulag, which I see in your bookshelf, I think, behind you, A History, Iron Curtain, and Autocracy Inc., explore the mechanics of totalitarian regimes and their modern successors. Anne is also a staff writer at The Atlantic and senior fellow at Johns Hopkins SNF Agora Institute. And Anne splits her time between Poland, London, and Washington, D.C., where I had the pleasure of meeting her. And I think, Anne, you were recently teaching at GW as well, is that right?
No, I've never taught at GW. I mean, I've taught at Johns Hopkins, but
Johns Hopkins. Okay, yeah, I know
that's
you
right.
were doing a course there on
Yeah.
sort of similar things. So very, very interesting. Well, with that, I'd like to start off with some of, just get the audience to know you a little bit better. If you can share a little bit about your personal journey, but are there, in thinking about penning Autocracy Inc., was there any particular experience from your time in Eastern Europe that really drove you to pen this work?
I mean, my experience in Eastern Europe is most of my life. So, for those of you who don't know, I actually moved here. I'm in Poland now, and I first came here in the late 80s. I was here during the collapse of communism, and I traveled at that time all around the region. I was a freelance reporter, when I was about 25 or something. And I wrote about the end of communism in this part of the world. Also, later, I spent a lot of time in the 90s in Russia. I was doing research for my book on the history of the Gulag, but also I did a lot of reporting in Russia. And so the memory of the end, the collapse of a totalitarian regime, and the attempt to piece democracy together is something is a very strong, and it's something I remember personally.
Mhm.
And I've, of course, watched over the last decade or so as some partly coming from Russia, but partly coming from other sources. People are trying to put back together not that system, but certainly a system that's antithetical to liberal democracy.
Mhm.
And really, the experiences there are too many to list. I mean, I
Yeah.
watched it. I lived in Poland when we had an authoritarian populist government win in 2015. And they immediately began seeking to make the judiciary politicized. When I saw many of the same electoral patterns happen in the United States the following year, I was very, very struck by the comparison. And over the whole time, I've really watched. I started by, of course, watching Russia, but then I began to understand that Russia works in conjunction with others, and that there is a group of autocracies, many of whom don't have much in common ideologically or anything in common ideologically, and who are sometimes in very different parts of the world. I mean, Venezuela and Iran aren't related in any way that you can think of, except that they both are run by dictators who seek to, who are under sanctions, whose economies are outside of the world system, who therefore both got involved in lots of clandestine finance and clandestine trade, who borrow repressive tactics from one another, who help one another in different ways. And once you start following that subject, you see that there's really a lot of it. I was mostly interested in the one. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of dictatorships and quasi-democracies, and I'm not trying to classify all countries or even talk about this as a bloc or an alliance, because it doesn't work like that. But I was mostly interested in the countries who have identified the language of democracy as dangerous for them. and have begun seeking to push back on it, both against inside their own countries, but also around the world. And that's Russia, China, Iran, um, uh, uh, again, Venezuela,
Yeah.
and a handful of others. And that's
Yeah.
what, so the book really comes out of my experience writing about this stuff over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, it's an incredible book and highly recommended for folks because it's just such an captivating read. I love how you describe it as a sort of gradient of sort of from autocracy to the opposite of autocracy, and it's not such a black and white binary. One of the interesting things from Autocracy Inc. that you had described was a global network of autocrats collaborating, right, to undermine democracy. You listed some of these earlier, but are you able to speak a little bit more about maybe one or two things that are surprising about how these regimes work together that most people perhaps don't know about?
I think probably it's hard to understand how they are hard. It's interesting anyway to learn about how they imitate one another's rhetoric and
Mm,
tactics. Sometimes it's very, I traced one particular story. There was a story that right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russians put out this elaborate conspiracy theory about biolabs, okay, that there were these biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And somehow it wasn't actually ever very clear, but they were there. And that was somehow an excuse for the invasion. And the point of them telling the story was to kind of muddy the narrative. Russia had invaded Ukraine. They'd launched this attack on an innocent country, and the attempt was to make Ukraine look less innocent,
mhm.
essentially. And what was interesting to me is that of course, the Russians did this. Their diplomats said it. They put it out on all their media, also on all of they have quite a lot of media that they've created that looks Chilean or Ecuadorian or
Yes.
Singaporean, but is actually Russian. And so they put it out on all those forms as well. But also the Chinese picked up this same thing, this same story, and they put it out on all of their media. And their media is enormous. They have huge state-funded TV and radio and all kinds of websites all over Africa, all over Asia. And they put it out on that. And then I got interested in picking up the story, and then I found it everywhere. I mean, the Iranians had it on their media, the Venezuelans had it on their media, the Nicaraguans had it on their media, the Cubans as well. So
Mm,
these, the speed and I should say, I don't think there's like a central room where they all plan the stories out and they agree that this is what they're going to do. It's just that they watch each one watches what the other is doing, and they pick up the things that work or that will have traction, and they repeat them elsewhere. And actually, they do the same with tactics of repression. So at some point, I think the Chinese originally figured out that sometimes the best things to do with big demonstrations is not to attack them, like to let them die out, and instead attack the leaders, seek to undermine their credibility and their character. And then once they had perfected this way of dealing with political dissent, you then began to see others doing it. So I think the fact that there is a playbook and there are tactics and they learn the tactics from one another, that would probably surprise most people.
right. And I guess the common elements of organic virality, which a lot of, current society focuses on in terms of spreading the news as well. One of the other things that was really interesting in the book you noted is that the Western financial systems now sometimes enable autocrats by laundering their wealth, whether intentionally or otherwise. But what is one practical step you think democracies can take to kind of close or at least tighten these loopholes?
Oh, this is easy. I mean, this could be done. There is a whole world of clandestine finance, of an alternate reality where people don't pay taxes, where they keep their money in secret, where they buy property in the name of companies whose owners are unnamed. That world has been created by our legal systems, by American and European legal systems, and we could uncreate it. I mean, we could just make it illegal to have a shell company. Sorry, if you have a company, someone's name has to be on it. Or if you've bought an apartment in Manhattan or a house in central London, you have to say who the owner is.
Mhm.
And those are laws that could be changed pretty fast and easily if we had the willpower to do it. And there's a lot of lobbying that goes against the idea of changing these laws. But in principle, eliminating anonymity from the financial system,
Mhm.
and making it impossible for people to move money around the world anonymously. I mean, this is something that could be done. It could be done within individual countries, but it could certainly be done by a consortia of countries. I mean, you could put together, if you could put together 30 European and Asian and African countries and agree on agree to eliminate this, you would do you could protect those countries at least from suffering from the impact of what would in the U.S. we call dark money. I mean, one of my theories is that a lot of this anonymous money is then used in politics. I mean, it's used to
Exactly.
people who have money seek to use it in order to shape the political system of where it is that they live or work. And it's really detrimental to all of us. I mean, it's a strange issue because it's not one that everyday people see. I mean, you don't walk down the street and you don't know that the house you're walking by is owned by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and it's not something that's written on the door frame. But actually that way of owning property and that way of doing business is pretty harmful to democracies, and it's important to push back against it.
Yeah, it's hard when there are conflicting interests for folks who are legislating and in their interest to keep things private as well. I suppose you also see a lot of that in London too, in the real estate. And I guess in your view, why do you think, and this is a little bit of, I guess, armchair psychology, pop psychology here, but from your experience, why do you think some people are drawn to authoritarian narratives? I guess what makes it compelling, even in strong democracies like US, Mexico, Poland?
Well, so this was actually a topic of my previous book. I wrote a book
Yes.
called Twilight of Democracy, and really the main
Yeah.
subject was what is the attraction? And I was particularly interested in what is the attraction for intelligent, educated people who speak languages and travel around the world.
Mhm.
And so no, so it's not just I didn't want to just talk about talk about it in an obvious way. And I think a lot of the answer lies in there are two things I would say. One, a lot of the answer lies in a kind of disappointment, if whatever it is about your society that you don't like, is it you don't like the morality, you don't like the acceptance of gay people or feminism, you feel it's going in an immoral direction, or or in the case of some countries you feel it's too divided and it's too unequal, and it's
Yeah.
this disappointment with the democratic system that leads people to look for some alternative. And of course, the alternatives are dictatorships, one in one form or another, or usually it's the form of a one-party state that people become attracted to. And there's another element too, though, which is that we now live in an era where things are changing very fast. So the nature of work changes, the nature of education is changing, how we get and process information is changing. Social mores change, demographics change. And every time, if you look back in history, every moment when there's been this level of radical and revolutionary change, you have some people who say stop and who we want something simpler. We want something easier to understand. We don't want this cacophony of arguing voices in our heads all day. And they become sometimes nostalgic for a previous era when things were
Hmm.
simpler and there was only one leader or one party or one way of doing things, and you get these backwards looking moves. I mean, you actually have it in Germany at the end of the 19th century. You always have it after civil wars. You have it after the French Revolution, and you have it in America now, I think, and in a lot of other countries. And so
Yeah.
it's almost like the cacophony and noise and drama of change, and especially of our very broken democratic politics, that I think leads people to say, well, what we need is just, I don't want to hear all this. I want one voice. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, the fact is that most autocracies lead to poverty, and they certainly lead to restraints on people's freedom. But people don't see that immediately. They learn it only later.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very difficult to sort of, as my co-founder John always says, it's very difficult to sort of champion the benefits of a democratic system in a soundbite that's three or four words. It's very difficult to succinctly push it. And as just someone who's lived across the world, but particularly in the US and Poland, what is one lesson from Eastern Europe's history that you think Western democracies should heed to protect themselves, or at least inoculate themselves from authoritarianism?
Well, first of all, I would say that right now, the country whose democracy is declining the fastest is the United States.
Mm.
And so, um, you know, I'm not sure that this situation is
We're
worse
treating a sick patient.
here than there. I mean, I think, and this is actually true whether you're in Eastern Europe or Western Europe or the U.S. or anywhere else. But I think listening to and understanding this populist language and recognizing it as a threat is important. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean policies, not even, I don't mean immigration or gay marriage or anything like that, but the language of we are the real people, we are the people who deserve to rule. Our opponents are vermin or enemies or foreigners or traitors. When you hear a politician talking like that,
Hmm.
instead of making arguments about policy, I think we should build more roads or we should build more schools, instead using this kind of cultural argument, existential arguments about preserving the essence of the nation against the foreigners and the vermin who want to undermine it. This should be a kind of red flag.
Hmm.
And we heard it actually during the last election campaign in the US. I remember it from Poland in 2015. There was our kind of, it was called the Law and Justice Party, ran on this platform that we're the true Poles and the other parties are enemies and traitors. And that kind of language, which does unify people, it sometimes can unify even a majority of the population, is the real, is the kiss of death for democracy. Because what it means is that once people like that come to power,
Hmm.
then they feel they have the right to change the system. Because of course, if your enemies are traitors and foreigners and people who are dangerous to the nation, then why should you ever let them win an election again? You know,
Right.
and so listening for this language and understanding why it's dangerous. It's not dangerous because of we can have, as societies, we can have civilized conversations about immigration. Should there be more? Should there be less? How should we order it? That's a legitimate topic of debate. Um, but the existential argument, having a party in power who thinks that only they have the right to rule, that's really dangerous. And so learning to listen for that is important.
Right. We're starting to see a little bit of that flagging up here and there, a lot of orange flags. I know we only have about 13 minutes left, so I want to use this opportunity to encourage folks from the audience to please think about their questions and drop them in the Q&A. My last question to you, Anne, is thinking about sort of the news of the day. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but Ukraine has just pulled off one of the most incredible sort of military feats on Russia overnight. And I think, this will obviously have big implications for their ongoing quote unquote peace talks in Istanbul. But you wrote about this recently about sort of your visit to Lviv and your thoughts about the peace process. How are you able to share a little bit more about that and your assessment of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia situation?
Sure. I would say, first of all, I think the Ukrainians are very badly underestimated.
Yes.
They
I know that.
are, and the way they're fighting the war isn't very well understood. So at the beginning of this conflict, people talked about it as, one big former Soviet army fighting a smaller former Soviet army, and maybe there was some truth to that 3 years ago. The Ukrainians are now fighting probably one of the most sophisticated wars that has ever taken place. It's a drone war. And they've learned to use drones in ways that nobody previously imagined. So
Mhm.
what happened last weekend is they smuggled them into Russia. They put them in trucks. They opened up they had a way of opening the trucks up simultaneously. The drones flew out of the trucks and went to hit aircraft. I think some of the trucks had been sent there for some time.
Yep.
So it was sort of an amazing, but that's not, even what they do every day, which is the monitoring of the front line and the countering of Russian drone and artillery attacks with drones that mostly they've made and they've designed, and the software also is what they designed, is pretty mind-boggling. And it's a reminder of why the Ukrainians want to be a democracy. It's a very
Mhm.
sophisticated society, and they want to be part of the world of technology and conversation and open exchange, and not locked behind some kind of
Yeah.
Russian occupation. The difficulty with the talks is that so far, the Russians have never said that they want to end the war. They've never agreed to a ceasefire. They've never, said that they want Ukraine to be an independent nation. They don't talk about ending the war. And there's even a strange thing that's happened over the last few weeks, which is that Donald Trump, by talking about the ceasefire, and other Europeans as well, by saying there's going to be ceasefire talks, have given the impression that there could be a ceasefire soon, or maybe they're close to reaching one. But actually, as I say, although the Ukrainians have said they would respect a ceasefire if the Russians would, the Russians have never done it. And so
Mm,
what worries me about these talks is that they are a little illusory. I mean, until the Russians understand that they can't win the war, and until they understand that Ukraine needs to end the war as an independent sovereign country, and we
right.
can argue about the border later on, where it should be, then the war is not going to be over.
Hmm.
And anything else, I mean, the Ukrainians are not going to accept some Russian puppet regime taking over. You know, they're not going to accept. They're not going to voluntarily transfer more land to the Russians, which is what they were asked to do in the first meeting in Istanbul. Until the Russians understand that they can't win, the war isn't over. And so, unfortunately, what I think that means is that the best tactic for the supporters of Ukraine and others who care about security in Europe is to continue supporting Ukraine, to tighten sanctions on Russia until the Russians understand that they're not going to win.
Right.
And unfortunately, there were, particularly the way the talks began, there was a moment when I was very worried that the Russians had been re-inspired to continue fighting.
Mm,
Because it seemed like the Trump administration wanted to lift sanctions and all that kind of talk
yeah.
wasn't, instead of being in sort of encouraging the Russians to stop fighting, it actually encouraged them to keep fighting. And so
Yeah.
I don't think we're very close yet to the end of the war.
Right. And for the Ukrainians, they're not going to give up even without US government support, I think.
Well,
I'd
they
like
can't
to,
give up. And it's also
yeah.
important, one more thing that I don't know if people understand this either. Ukrainians can't give up because if they do, they die anyway. So,
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
people say, why do you want so many young men to die? Well, actually, more young men will die if they lose. And if you look
Yeah.
at what's happened in the occupied territories in Ukraine, there have been these concentration camps, there have been
Mhm.
murders and executions, their children have been kidnapped. I mean, what's happening in occupied Ukraine is not unlike what happened in Soviet occupied Poland or indeed Nazi occupied Europe. And
Mhm.
so people can't accept that. And so they will keep fighting to prevent that.
Course. Yeah, it's existential for them.
Yes.
I'd love to turn to some of our questions, Anne, as I want to be respectful of your time. The top question here is from Benjamin Rutledge, who is actually a dear friend of Intrigues and works in the human rights space. He would love to hear any reflections on this weekend's Polish presidential election and what Nawrocki's win may mean for the EU and Russia, Ukraine. I know we talked briefly about this, but you can, feel free to address that how you will.
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing to understand is that bizarrely, this election result was almost exactly the same as the election result 5 years ago. In other
Mhm.
words, it was very close. The difference between the two candidates was a few 100,000 votes. In a country of where I don't remember the exact number of people who vote, but it's many millions. And what you have in Poland, which is very similar to other countries, is essentially you have these kind of two political tribes. And it's bizarrely 50-50. I mean, all the polling at the end of the campaign was too close to call. On election night, actually, the exit polls gave the winner to Trzaskowski. This was the mayor of Warsaw.
Mm,
And it was only kind of during the night, as they began counting the real votes, that the other candidate, the law and justice candidate, won. So it's a very significant election because, of course, it's going to be it's going to make life very difficult for Poland's centrist government, which I should say my husband is in. He's the foreign minister, so
mhm,
take everything I say with a grain of salt if you want. Um, and the president's main power in Poland is his ability to veto things, and so
mhm,
he'll be able to stop change and he'll be able to stop reforms, which is what the current president has been doing. And it doesn't necessarily mean a huge change in Polish foreign policy because in Poland the prime minister controls that,
mhm.
and the government controls it, and the president doesn't have those abilities. But it makes the task of governing Poland and making Poland modern and prosperous a lot more difficult.
Mhm.
And it also shows once again how, it's very once just because you've defeated the authoritarian right once, it doesn't mean they remain defeated. And again, Poland is divided into people with two very different identities. They watch different media. They live in kind of different cultural worlds. And that was reflected in this election as it is reflected in US elections.
Yeah. And particularly it's 5 years. It's a very long term, isn't it? Compared
It's
to
a
the,
5-year term.
yeah, in
Yeah.
Australia, we've got 3 years. I'd love to, with probably the last question, I'm not sure how we're going to go for this, but I want to combine a couple of questions here, one from Evan and another one from, well, a couple of folks actually. It's the same vein, but they want to ask about the sort of how our geopolitical, or how our political situation, sorry, is a natural result of our voting systems and government structures. So a question about the systematic kind of errors or the systematic flaws in our systems. Do you have any thoughts about how a democracy can be built to be stable long term and less susceptible to would-be autocrats? And I guess, how do you see a way out of this for the US, which is paraphrasing a lot of our questioners?
I mean, the difficulty in the US is we have a constitution that's become very hard to change. And so it's,
Mm,
clearly our electoral college belongs to the 18th century and it doesn't make sense in the modern world. It doesn't even do what it was meant to do. The electoral college was originally this very actually anti-democratic in the modern sense idea that sort of wise men in each state would, if the people voted for the wrong person, the wise men
mhm.
would change the result, and that would, so that bad people wouldn't become president. I mean, literally, it was put a kind of bar between the voting public and the presidency, and it actually has never worked like that. I mean, it has never, the electoral college never functioned the way it was supposed to function. It just did this strange
Cool, cool, cool.
thing of meaning that it's really, really important if you vote in Pennsylvania and if you vote in California, your vote doesn't count. I mean, that's kind of
Or
that's
DC, actually.
or DC. Well, DC is a separate issue, but
Mm,
it wasn't supposed to be that. I mean, I think generally speaking, the advantage of parliamentary systems is they allow for the existence of multiple parties, which is usually more fair and more reflective of people's views. I mean, in the US, we actually have several parties, but we deal with it by talking about, I don't know, liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats, or liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans, or
mm.
or sometimes we identify groups. It's clear that the MAGA movement is not the same thing as the Republican Party. I mean, it's taken
Yep.
over the Republican Party, but there are many people in that party who wouldn't want to be in it, and so it's a, our political system doesn't reflect the range of views in the country. And so I would say that. I mean, if I think about democracies, though, that are really stable, almost all of them have a really important local component. I'm just thinking about Switzerland, which is a
Mm.
country where there are even some towns in Switzerland where people vote in person, like everyone comes into the square and raises their hand. And the more, and Switzerland has this very localized, because they have four languages
Cantons,
and they have
yeah.
cantons. And so democracy takes place on this very, very micro level. And I think that creates a lot of stability because when people, particularly Americans, when we think about politics, it's almost like it really is like world wrestling. It's like there are these giants on the screen, there's Trump and Kamala and this person, and it's
Right.
so far away from ordinary people's experience and has nothing to do with the issues that they have in their lives. And it's very, and it can seem very abstract. I mean, who you vote for, what does that have to do with what you're going to, I
Hmm.
mean, of course, actually, politics structures everything. It structures how you get health care. It structures how much you're paid. It structures how your taxes work. It structures whether you have your roads get fixed or not and how your schools work. But people somehow don't connect this kind of battle of the titans that they see on TV with that stuff.
Hmm.
And that's why any system that uses where local politics are more important than national politics is one that functions better, I think.
Yeah. And the roles of citizens' assemblies and hopefully leveraging technology to bring that closer as
Well,
well.
so if that's something you guys are, that's something I'm really interested in that you
Oh,
don't see much conversation about it in the US,
yeah.
is how the internet could be used to help democracy instead of destroying it.
Mm.
Because the way social media is structured, I'm telling you things, of course, social media is not built to enhance democracy or make people have better debates or have evidence-based conversations. It's
No.
it's built to it's built to sell advertising.
Right.
So the way you get people to stay online and look at advertising is to make them really angry or upset or
Hmm.
else very happy to be inside their bubble. Whatever the different forms of social media is a little bit different, but But you could imagine, and people have tried to imagine it, as I'm sure you know, forms of social media or public debate that use the internet in a creative way that's engaging and useful.
Hmm.
And we're pretty far away from anyone talking seriously about that now in the US, but I'm aware of experiments in Taiwan
Yes.
that have tried to do that. I'm sure you're
We
aware.
had Audrey Tang
You
on the
had
show
Audrey
as well.
Tang. All
Yeah.
right. Well, then you know.
She's
There's a
fantastic.
there's a Brazilian version as well. There are
Oh,
Brazilian towns that have tried to do online debates about local budgets and so on. I mean, that seems to me, rather than thinking about rewriting the Constitution or which political system would work better in the US, which is a pretty theoretical conversation since we're not going to change it. I mean, thinking about how you would get better democracy by getting people to speak to one another different ways. I mean, that's a really useful and interesting conversation.
yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Anna. We had a ton of questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to, but hopefully folks will be able to read this book, Autocracy Inc., which is the latest, as well as all her other work at The Atlantic. I'm a huge fan, Intrigue, a huge fan. We're so happy to have you on the show, and thank you for being here with us. And best of luck in your, with your summer in Poland. Lots of
Thank you
exciting
very
things
much.
ahead.
Great to meet you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And
Thank
please
you.
sign up for International Intrigue at www.internationalintrigue.io. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.